Hi, everybody. This is Tim Garner, and this is week 7 of our overview study of Deuteronomy. And we'll be looking at chapters 21 through 24 today. Lots of material still to cover and a review. So let's get started. Let me share my screen. There we go. Move myself up there. So the theme verse that I chose really for this week is from chapter 24, verse 17 and 18. You shall not pervert the justice due. You shall not pervert the justice due an alien or an orphan, nor take the widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing. And he'll come back to that idea of God redeeming them and use that as an explanation or a basis for why he's teaching them what he's commanding them, what he's commanding them. So here's the sermon outline of the book, really, that we've been talking about. And we're still in the second section, the longest section of the book. It's introspective, where we look within to what God expects. Then here's the Nelson's Bible Dictionary outline, which describes the three sections: historical, what God has done for Israel; legal, what God expects of Israel; and prophetic, which is what we'll get to it toward the last there, what God will do for Israel. And right now we're in the third part of the second section, the explanation of the various ceremonial laws, the additional laws, social laws, civil laws, and so on. And we're actually now talking about the final part of that, the social laws, laws about social justice and things like that. So you shall not pervert the justice due. So chapter 21 breaks down as purity in community and family, neighbors and marriage in chapter 22, purity in intermingling and cleanness in chapter 23, and purity in marriage and society in chapter 24. So here's Calvin as we try to look at the idea of injustice or justice. Calvin's upset. Shovel the walk, shovel the walk. That's all I'm good for around here. What about my powerful intellect? My budding genius is being squandered. I aspire to more than brute slave labor. These hands, these amazing hands, are destined to create undreamt of wonders. Yet here they are worn to the bone in unfulfilling drudgery. What a monstrous injustice, he says. And then he bursts through the door and throws his clothes on the floor and says, geez, don't tell me lunch isn't ready. So I don't think he understands the idea of justice, but it's funny anyway. So chapter 21, community and family. The Lord does not condone the shedding of innocent blood in the first 9 verses there, actually. Specifically in that passage, he's establishing jurisdiction for a murder or a crime that's been committed that they don't really know who committed the crime, but they have to figure out a way to establish the community, the city that's going to atone for the crime, acknowledge it, and so on. I'll come back to the idea in a minute of how did they measure the distance to figure out which community would be responsible, which jurisdiction would be responsible. You're supposed to treat your spouse and your children fairly, and there's a couple of sections here where he talks about being fair to the wife. If a wife is chosen from spoils of war from among captives, then she's to be treated just as fairly as any other wife. Of course, the choosing of the wife would presuppose that this wife wasn't part of a group of captives from a city that was, as we've seen before, devoted to destruction. Remember, we talked about that, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 26. You're not supposed to bring any abominable thing into your house that was devoted to destruction. Chapter 20, verse 16 and 18. Specific cities of the Hittites and Amorites and Canaanites and Perizzites and so on were to be devoted to destruction. So that obviously the wife wouldn't have come from that area. But in situations where they were taken as captives, then a marriage could occur, and there were specific laws and ways of treating her and the children. Uh, and also in verse 15 through 17, you're supposed to be fair to the wives if you have multiple wives, whether they're loved or unloved. The firstborn rule still applies, whether the firstborn comes from the unloved or not. And here we can see from the example of Jacob that Jacob was married to Rachel and Leah first, and the firstborn came from Leah, Reuben, and still Reuben was the firstborn, even though Leah would have been considered unloved. And of course, the Lord took pity on her because of her situation there and gave her numerous children. Stubborn and rebellious children should be disciplined and are a cause of evil among the people. If you have a child who's disobedient, gluttonous, drunkard, and they will not repent, you can bring them to the elders of the city, and the possible result or sentence might be death. And here the idea of the people will hear and fear. It's a serious, this kind of disobedience and disrespect is a very serious infraction. And then there are specifics pointed out about if a person is convicted of a crime that's worthy of death, then if they're hanged up, if they're to be hanged, then there's a particular there's specifics about how they're to be hung, and they are to be considered accursed of God. And of course, this metaphor is used by Paul in Galatians 3, verse 13, where he uses the concept of being accursed to teach the power of the redemption of Jesus. It says there in so many words, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And of course, that's a quotation from this particular passage. So just a little side tangent here. How did they measure back then? Well, the first thing we can see here, now we have very sophisticated EDM, electronic distance meters. This is a piece of surveying equipment. There are other things. There are even handheld pocket-size EDMs that we can use. This is a survey chain, 22 yards, I believe. Measure 10 of those, and 10 of those square, and you end up with an acre, approximately an acre, if I'm recalling correctly. Never used one, but I've seen them before. But it's very possible that the Israelites borrowed the technology that the Egyptians, and this is an image of Egyptian engineers, surveyors, measuring using a kind of rope, which would be similar to the chain that you just saw. And it's very likely, it's highly likely actually, that the Israelites would have had the same sort of methodologies. And this goes to the idea of them being able to measure the distance to the city nearest where the crime was committed to establish the jurisdiction and so on. Just a little tangent there, if you will. Okay, chapter 22, neighbors in marriage. God expects us to be kind, courteous, and helpful to our neighbor, generally speaking. We're to be just, and we're to do what's best in helping our neighbor. And in several things here that have to do with the rights, respecting the rights, functions, and boundaries of others in community, that's an actual state of being, isn't it? First of all, a woman is to appear as a woman, a man is to appear as a man. And all of these things go to the idea of our purpose, our function, our role in society. And if you look at other passages, for example, Leviticus chapter 11, verse 32 and 33, there's terminology there that has to do with the idea of utensils being set aside, cleaned, prepared, and available for their purpose. And it has the idea of we have a purpose. We have a purpose in God's kingdom. And of course, that's what God expected of the Israelites also. Other things that are pointed out there in that passage, breeding stock is to maintain. You don't take the mother with the chicks if you raid a bird's nest. When you build your house, you're supposed to build a parapet. You're supposed to build a railing around it to keep your friends and loved ones safe. It doesn't matter if it costs extra. You're supposed to do it anyway. And then as we move on, God expects his people to remember his word daily. And one of the ways they did that is they sewed a tassel with a blue cord onto their garment. This is elaborated on in Numbers chapter 15, verse 37 through 41. They're supposed to have the tassel to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord so as to do them and not follow after their own heart and their own eyes, after which they played the harlot. He says, so that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. So, kind of like tying a string around your finger, I guess, sort of an extreme example of it. There's sort of an image, a visual there of what that might have looked like. And here's some actual garments, Jewish folk that are out and about with the tassels tied or attached to their garments. And then, of course, a big one here was God expects sexual purity to be maintained between men and women at all times. And that's a long passage. There's a lot of specifics in there about the sexual relationships. We'll get into that when we get to the review in just a few minutes. But the big thing, the most important thing is marriage is to be held in honor among all, Hebrews 13:4. And the marriage bed is to be undefiled, for fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Marriage is supposed to be a beautiful thing. But if we abuse or distort or pervert the idea of a relationship between a man and a woman, then it brings us under judgment. That's what he's trying to say there. So the Lord wants, chapter 23, the Lord wants purity when his people assemble. So eunuchs, illegitimate children, Ammonites, Moabites are not allowed in the assembly. The Edomites are, because they're considered a brother, descendants of Esau. Egyptians under specific conditions are allowed in the assembly. As we move on there, the Lord wants purity, both ceremonial and literal purity in the camp in verses 9 through 14. Moving on in the verses 15 through 25, under the heading of purity in relationships, verses 15 through 16, he wants them to provide sanctuary for slaves. They're not to send a slave back that runs away. They're not supposed to be involved in the slave trade, as we've seen already. Also under the heading of purity in relationships, let me go back. Purity in relationships, there's no member of a family, verses 17 and 18, is to be involved in the pagan prostitution. Sons, daughters, wives, whatever. They're all supposed to be pure in their relationships regarding lending laws. Their countrymen, they get zero interest. They're not supposed to charge interest. They can make it a business of lending when they're dealing with outsiders, foreigners, and so on. But otherwise, they're brothers. They do not charge interest. Also, they're supposed to be pure in their relationships in regard to laws of making vows. They always follow through on their vows, or they do not make them. And also in regard to their neighborly relationships, if they go into a field, they're only to consume what they need to consume for the moment. They're not supposed to do it in such a way that they're making a profit from it. So cleanness or cleanliness, let's see if we can understand the difference here. Charlie Brown says, Pigpen, have you ever heard that old saying? What old saying? Pigpen asks. Cleanliness is next to godliness, Charlie Brown says. Oh yes, many times, Pigpen says. Then why don't you follow it? Charlie Brown questions. Because with me, Charlie Brown, cleanliness is next to impossible. Maybe a little different idea, but it's funny nonetheless. By the way, that comic strip was from, I believe, April 4th of 1955. For those of you who might be interested in that kind of thing. Okay, now, chapter 24. You shall not pervert the justice due. Be pure in regard to marriage and society. Unlawful divorce and remarriage is an abomination to the Lord. You can't be flippant about marriage. Divorce is sanctioned, yes, but a woman can't leave one husband, go to another husband, and then that husband sends her away and she goes back to the original husband. It's not supposed to be a revolving door in regard to marriage. Marriage is a serious business. It's a deep, intimate relationship, and he wants them to take it seriously. And in fact, it's supposed to be a joyous relationship. In verse 5 there of chapter 24, a young man is supposed to get a year off from going to war just so he can help set up house. And in theory, in those times, probably children would have come along very quickly. So it's an important thing. It's a joyous thing. And in regard to pledging or collateral, a pledge should not deprive one of their basic necessities. Verse 6, as far as their trade, you can't take their means of trade. In lending, you can't take important aspects of their life or their livelihood as collateral. And worse yet, in verse 17 and 18, you can't take the basic things such as a cloak from a widow or an orphan. And all of this, he says, is predicated on the idea of them remembering where they came from the land of Egypt. They're supposed to do these things, be compassionate, be fair, because they remember where they came from. And again, human trafficking is evil. We've talked about this before, and it carries the death penalty. And also, they're supposed to respect and follow the guidance of their leaders. Remember how God dealt with disrespect in the past, and they're supposed to follow the guidance of their leaders, whether it's health issues or otherwise. Continuing on in chapter 4, do not oppress the poor, which is the very definition of this idea of you shall not pervert the justice due. You always pay fair wages, and you always pay on time. Each person is responsible for their own sin. And we know this, Ezekiel 18:20. The son will not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. And justice and mercy for the poor. So in verses 17 through 18, there's supposed to be pure justice for the alien, orphan, and widow. And in verses 19 through 22, there's supposed to be pure mercy for the alien, orphan, and widow. And again here, he harkens back to, remember, you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord redeemed you. It's a very powerful idea. It's a very comforting idea that we can remember, we can be thankful all the time for the great things that God has done for us. So remembering our past blessings from God will help us to bless others today and in the future. So in this idea of not perverting justice, Deuteronomy chapter 16, we've already talked about this. You shall not distort justice. Further on, he says, justice and only justice you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you. And this term, this idea of distort, actually comes from an idea of stretching out. Multiple times in Exodus, Moses and or Aaron are described as stretching out their hand to take an object, the rod or something like that. So it has a sort of a visual metaphor to it. But here, of course, it's used to talk about the idea of distorting or perverting justice. And then in Exodus 23, it says, you shall not pervert the justice due your needy brother in this dispute. And all of these things you're not supposed to do, because he says, you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers in the land of Egypt. So he's trying to give them the basis of empathy for where they have come from and how they should, as a basis for how they should behave. So let's review. Chapters 5, we covered the 10 Commandments, the restatement of the 10 Commandments. Chapter 12 was offerings at the place God chooses. Just a whole series of sermons there. Chapter 13, idolatry is forbidden. Punishments are pointed out. Chapter 14, pagan cutting is forbidden. The definition of clean and unclean animals in detail there. And also tithing is described. Chapter 15, then debt, poverty, servants, and the first of the flock is to be provided. Chapter 16, the Passover, 3 major feasts, Passover, unleavened bread, Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. They're to have righteous judges and judgment. Idolatry, again, is pointed out as being punished. There are specific, sort of the Supreme Court idea is presented there in chapter 17, judgment in hard matters. And the king, when they select him, is supposed to respect God's word as well. In chapter 18, the idea of the supporting of the priesthood is presented, and also the prohibition or forbidding of, divination and spiritism. Chapter 19 covers the cities of refuge, the idea of how murder is to be punished, do not move landmarks or boundaries, and also false testimony is to be punished. Chapter 20 presents rules of war, and then chapter 21 covers atoning for an unknown murder that we just looked at, marriages of captive wives, sons from loved or unloved wives, how to deal with rebellious children, laws for the accursed, assisting your neighbor in chapter 22, and then relationship issues, mixed apparel is forbidden, breeding stock animal protection is pointed out there, and the importance of making our homes safe, building safety codes, if you will. Unlawful mixing and combining of things is forbidden. The border fringes are enjoined to help them remember God's law. And then there are laws of spousal purity, consensual sex. This is all the details in that passage. And laws regarding forced sex, marriage to a virgin, and sex with the mother is forbidden. And in chapter 23, there are the exclusions to the assembly. Remember unclean issues of having an unclean camp. Escaped servants are to receive sanctuary, not sent back to their master. No forced prostitution or sodomy. And further on in the chapter, specifics of lending and interest laws, and always follow through with your vows or promises, or don't make them. And then finally, neighborly provisions for hunger. Then laws of divorce, laws of compassion in all relationships, laws of just punishment and just pay, more laws related to marriage, just weights and measure, and then he throws in there, remember Amalek, their enemy, the one who committed sin against them and wasn't hospitable to them. And then finally, he brings up laws of first fruits, generosity, and dedication. So, behave. Lucy says, my dad's away on a trip. Linus and I try to see who can behave the best while he's away. It's sort of a contest that our dad started. I don't think he can really tell who wins, though, because he always says the same thing. In case of a tie, duplicate prizes will be awarded. So the message of this particular passage, these chapters, is purity, community, and family. Chapter 21, purity with neighbors and marriage relationships. Purity of intermingling and cleanness. Chapter 23, and purity in marriage and society continued there. Grace and blessings to all of you in the rest of your week. Bye for now.